Welcome back to the Untold Civil War. We are doing another episode of our segment on myths of the Civil War. We're busting these myths with Detective Robert Girardi. And today we're going to be discussing this common myth: engineers are overly cautious and won't fight. Where does this come from? Why do we hear about this?
I think, again, if you look at, I think we blame George B. McClellan, probably one of the most famous engineer officers of the Civil War, okay, until we think about it. But what's McClellan's downfall? He has this huge army, he has all this manpower and equipment, and he won't fight. He's cautious. He's afraid to fight. He's going to believe all kinds of misinformation about the size of the enemy, and he never has enough. He's cautious. So that's a label that you put on. I think part of it, I think the genesis of it really is like an inter-service rivalry. You know, what's the other? Engineers won't fight, they're cautious. What's the other jibe? Whoever saw dead cavalrymen, right? It's the infantry jibe against the cavalry, because cavalry goes, they ride around in circles and they never really do any serious fighting, except the fact that they do, right? Or the artillery. So I think you have some of these kind of things, and they become truisms, like Pope saying his headquarters are going to be in the saddle. He never said that. That's an old army thing. That the Romans were probably saying that, about Polybius or Caesar somewhere, that his headquarters were in the saddle. But they sound funny. You get a cheap laugh. You get a newspaper headline, and so we get this myth that engineers are cautious by nature and won't fight, and so that's used to tear down McClellan. And now McClellan wasn't cautious because he was an engineer. McClellan was cautious because he was McClellan, but he happened to be an engineer. But then that's also used to disparage other generals, like we talked about earlier. Warren's an engineer. He's a McClellan guy. He's cautious. Unless you look at his career and see, if anything, he's sometimes he's shut down for being too bold. But not to make it about him. Who are the engineer officers in the Civil War? Can you think of a few just off the top of your head, other than McClellan and Warren? Those are throwaways. Who's the most famous Confederate engineer?
Lee.
Is he cautious? I mean, you have it on good authority that his very name might be Audacity, right? But why? Because he's an army commander. All of a sudden, well, it doesn't apply to him. He's the exception to the rule. Okay, well, every rule has to have an exception, otherwise it's not a rule, right? So there are times when you have to have the exceptions. But let's look at the engineers in the Civil War. At the beginning of the war, in 1861, the Corps of Engineers in the Army is divided into two branches. You have the Engineer Corps and the topographical engineers, the guys who did the surveying and the maps. During the war in 1863, those two will be melded into one to just be the Engineer Corps. But at the beginning of the war, or right before the war in 1861, there are a total of about 93, 93 or 94 engineer officers in the Engineer Corps. Many of these men will become Civil War engineers. Most of them will stay with the Union. A few of them, a handful of them, I think 15, go with the Confederate States. So 15 out of 93. So that leaves 78 engineer officers now in the Union Army. There are some, and again, some of them are not good commanding generals. Many of them never become Army commanders or even Corps commanders. But many of them become brigade and division commanders, and some of them never really leave strictly engineering duties, especially the old timers who are going to be the guy like Zealous Tower. Okay, Zealous Tower in 1864 is in charge of the railroad defenses of the Department of the Middle Department, so the military division of the Mississippi. So he's doing railroad defense for Sherman. He's an engineer, right? Herman Haupt is going to be. He's a civilian, but he will be a brigadier. He's not an army commander, but he totally takes over the U.S. military railroads and building bridges and things like that. So these guys, I don't think it's fair to label them cautious, because they're not acting in a capacity where they can be anything but cautious. But how about somebody like James St. Clair Morton? You ever heard of him? James St. Clair Morton is an engineer who is in the Western Theater, is in charge with the Army of the Cumberland with Rosecrans, and he develops canvas pontoon boats and other things, and he's in charge of the pioneer brigades that are an adjunct to the engineer corps, where each infantry regiment would designate a handful of men who become the pioneer corps, and they had their own logo on the sleeve of the uniform with the axe and the pick and the axe on their shoulders, and they would go out and they would build the corduroy roads and the bridges and things because there weren't enough engineer troops to do it. But this is going to be their task, so they're going to be doing this kind of fatigue work. St. Clair Morton then goes, excuse me, he makes his way. He's now with the Army of the Potomac, and he gets killed in action at Petersburg in the assaults in June of 1864. Now, he's not commanding troops. He's there doing engineer work. So he's a KIA engineer. If he was cautious, he would be doing what Zealous Tower did, sitting in a tower and looking at reports and coordinating movements and coming up with other things. Well, let's go to the Confederate Army. The engineers, you heard of Lee. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard is an engineer. Now, is he a great commander? No, but he's certainly not cautious. Look at some of the goofy ideas he came up with for bold planning, unrealistic, but certainly not cautious. So even for somebody as arguably inept or in over his head as Beauregard, that label doesn't apply. Well, what about Joseph E. Johnston? Johnston had one of the most diverse careers of any officer in the pre-Civil War Army because he was everything, including an engineer during the Mexican War. He's an engineer, so was Beauregard. Another Army commander. So you have three Army commanders that were engineers.
One thing I'd throw out there too in regards to Beauregard is, you know, as the guy who fires the first shot, that's not very cautious, I think.
Right.
Pretty bold,
right.
I think.
If you look at, especially if you go to the Mexican War, look at what some of the engineers were doing, especially Lee, but McClellan and others, they're finding ways to enable Winfield Scott to do some really dramatic things on the battlefield that were unheard of because of their bold initiative and the risks they took to do this. Well, these are things they're bringing into Army command. Look at one of the most innovative engineers as an Army commander on either side during the course of the war, William Stark Rosecrans, Army engineer, leading the Army of the Cumberland after Perryville. And what does he do? Well, he works with St. Clair Morton to make that pioneer brigade. When he moves from after the Battle of Stones River, after the Army gets reacclimated, and here's where the cautious thing is, he won't go forward, he won't attack. A third of his army was killed, wounded, and otherwise disabled in December of 1862, and you want him to be doing something in May of 1863. Well, he wants to, but he has to refit. He has to defend the town where he is. He has to supply the army. He has to rebuild the railroads. He has to defend he builds Fortress Rosecrans as it becomes the biggest earthwork fort built during the Civil War, which every soldier in that army writes about in their letters and diaries. But when he finally does maneuver out of Murfreesboro through the Tullahoma campaign and just flanks Bragg out of Tennessee, at the same time that two engineers are fighting in Pennsylvania, Meade, an Army engineer, against Lee, an Army engineer, two Army commanders, and down in Vicksburg, Grant is doing something simultaneous with Tullahoma, and Rosecrans is sniping with another Army engineer, Henry Wager Halleck, in Washington, about who's going to get the next promotion. Why I didn't kill enough men to be recognized. I just won a victory here. Seizing the objective of Chattanooga without killing 30,000 men like happened in Tennessee 6 months ago. So bold. Rosecrans mistakenly believes that Bragg is demoralized after evacuating Chattanooga and divvies his army up into three pieces and goes over the mountains into North Georgia. Well, he marches into a trap, but is that cautious? But at the same time he's doing that, he had the foresight to send down to Chattanooga on his campaign from Tullahoma steamboats, in wagons. So he had a wagon train carrying steamboats, which he assembled in Chattanooga to put on the Tennessee River so that he could keep a supply line open. Who thinks of that? Engineers do. They put those pieces in place. Well, those are just a few. The Chief of Staff in the Army of the Potomac, Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, pre-war engineer, happened to be Warren's boss working on hydrographic studies on the Mississippi River before the war. Is he cautious? He wants to fight. His division at Fredericksburg fights in front of Murray's Heights. There's a monument to him up in the cemetery there at the top of the hill. He wants a field command, but he decides he accepts the Chief of Staff, but he wants a corps command, and he gets it finally. He gets the Second Corps, the tail end of the Petersburg campaign. Grenville Dodge, railroad man. He's an engineer. He's leading troops, but he's leading troops. They're going out into the middle of nowhere and building bridges and culverts and things in enemy territory. So they're fighting as they're building, and they're getting the job done. How about Joseph Mansfield? He's cautious. He becomes a corps commander right at the beginning of the 1862 Maryland campaign, and he's mortally wounded leading his division at the Battle of Antietam. Another cautious guy. How about James Birdseye McPherson, Army commander, Army of the Tennessee, in July of 1864? He's killed in action leading his troops in the Battle of Atlanta. Where's his caution? It gets applied to McClellan and anybody who is perceived to be or accused of being a McClellan acolyte, like Warren, overcautious subordinate. Everything's got to be in place. Let's look at 1864 at Petersburg. You have several campaigns operating against Lee's supply line on the Weldon Railroad. You have one under Winfield Scott Hancock in the Second Corps at Reams Station. They go down there and they are going to seize the railroad and break up track on the Weldon Railroad. Well, Hancock is not an engineer, never was an engineer, probably couldn't spell engineer, but he gets attacked by the Confederates and creates a defensive position, but bungles the defenses. They don't build earthworks the right way. They don't do it the right way. And there's a whole book on this called A Melancholy Affair on the Weldon Railroad, where several thousand men get captured because Hancock bungles the job. Then in August, you have Gouverneur Warren being told to break the railroad, the Weldon Railroad, a little up, a couple miles up road from Reams Station. And Warren is told to disrupt the railroad. Well, he goes out there. He builds a corduroy road through the woods on the way there. He leaves some of his supply wagons behind so his men can get to the railroad and start breaking it up while the rest of the slow coaches come up. He breaks the railroad, immediately builds a fort, and holds the railroad, even though there's some problem with troop placement that's got nothing to do with him. It's just his orders aren't properly obeyed and the dispositions aren't laid out the right way. But there's several furious attempts to retake the railroad and drive him away. And instead of it just being a raid on the railroad, it becomes a permanent lodgment on the railroad. But he's an engineer. He did it the right way. He had the pieces in place and he laid out the defenses so that when the counterattack came, he could successfully repulse it. And that's not caution, it's prudence.
Right.
So you get these guys who are engineers. Many of them are killed in action. We talked about Mansfield. We talk about James St. Clair Morton. You've got McPherson, and then many of them are also corps commanders. At the end of the war, in 1865, the beginning of the year, look at the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James. You have Army of the Potomac commander, George B. Meade, engineer. Second Corps commander is Humphreys, engineer. Fifth Corps commander, Warren, engineer. Sixth Corps commander, Horatio Wright, engineer. Ninth Corps commander, John Park, engineer. Go to the Army of the James, you have two engineer officers, Godfrey Weitzel is one of the corps commanders, and Gilmore is Quincy A. Gilmore is Corps Commander. All engineers. Why? If they're cautious, why are all these engineers in the Western armies? You've got Orlando Poe. You've got James Harrison Wilson is an engineer. He's leading the Corps. He's the guy that kicks Forrest's butt in the Selma campaign finally in 1865. Orlando Wilcox is with the Ninth Corps. You have Daniel Woodbury, an engineer who's building the bridges for the Army of the Potomac the whole time under fire. Where does the caution come from?
Well, and yeah, no, another thing when I was just thinking about engineers is, we talk about they're not always just in the rear. If we think about Fredericksburg,
no, they're in the front.
Yeah, at Fredericksburg, they're tasked with building that pontoon bridge.
That's right.
It's only under heavy fire from Barksdale's boys that they eventually have to do sort of an amphibious assault. But they were out there trying to build this bridge under fire.
Right.
There's no caution there.
No, you've got Washington Roebling riding around in the wilderness and other places doing engineer work, leading infantry forces to the right spot of attack. And not just him. That's what the engineers were doing all throughout the war, in every theater. You need a handful of guys to go into enemy territory and map it and find out where the bridges are and whether or not they're sustainable for all arms. So can artillery, the heavy artillery trains, make it across this bridge, or do we need to bring bridging material? And if we do bring bridging material, where's the appropriate place to put it? Well, guess what? In the Western theater, early in the war in 1861 in West Virginia, James E. Merrill, an engineer officer, gets captured doing that kind of work in the mountains of West Virginia. And he's held POW for a while, and he comes back and he draws the maps and builds the railroad defenses for Don Carlos Buell and for William T. Sherman during the Atlanta campaign. The blockhouse system of defenses for the railroads were designed by him. So frontline guy.
Yeah, I think sometimes it reminds me even today of the sort of animosity between the branches and stuff. The infantry guys are going to yell at the Cav guys, and Cav guys are always going to yell at the engineer guys, and kind of happens
look at
it
in the police department. You got the beat guys who, the dicks, they're just prima donnas, right?
Yeah.
You got the detectives, these idiot patrolmen who don't know what they're doing. They couldn't find they can't find their shoes in the morning. And then you got the house mice, right? Who have no idea where outside is except the parking lot. And so I think these are natural I don't want to say animosities. I think that's overstating it, but I think they're inter-service rivalries that help you to poke fun at the other guy, good-naturedly or not, and sometimes deserved and oft times not. But I think it's natural. But I think it's applied specifically in the Civil War because of McClellan.
And so, what would you say in summarizing this? Knowing this, how does that give us a better chance of understanding the Civil War as a whole?
Well, I think for me, because I'm not really a battle guy. I like the behind the scenes stuff. So I like to look at the command structures or the logistics or some of the other aspects of the support services, Signal Corps, that sort of thing, without which the great campaigns are impossible. So McClellan may have been cautious as a battlefield commander, but as a strategic planner, the Peninsula Campaign was bolder than brass. Take this army, abandon Washington in Lincoln's mind, right? Leave a sufficient, in McClellan's mind, force. I'm not going to rehash all that, but leave a defensive force behind to forestall an immediate threat and bring the balance of the army to the least expected place with overwhelming force and take them from behind. That's bold. So I think we have to understand that what the nature of the job is, but also to realize, all engineers are cautious. Yeah, everybody knows that. Well, I'm part of everybody. I don't know that because I don't see it. The evidence doesn't take me there. And I think, again, if you want an intelligent understanding of the war, of why things work the way they do, you have to look at some of these aspects. These men didn't get into those positions by mistake. And my favorite example is the end of the war. Most of the top spots, especially in the Eastern Theater, are all former engineers or current engineers, Army and Corps commands, all of them.
And I think that was sort of, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when people were graduating for West Point, I think that was a point of honor, right? If you had the highest scores, highest marks, you probably were going to become an engineer.
Top 5 or 6 guys in every class usually went to the engineer corps.
Right, because there was so much training and so much you needed to know in order to do that, whether it came with mapping or building bridges, whatever the case may be.
Well, West Point's an engineering school.
Right.
Tactics are an elective course at West Point in this era. The purpose of the school is to be engineers, to have men of science, because the engineer corps is, I mean, the Corps of Engineers now, what do? They're doing hydrographic work. They're building dikes and dams and coastal works and keeping the waterways out of the cityways, right? And like at New Orleans and other places, chronically at New Orleans. Robert E. Lee, there's a monument, not a monument, a marker to Robert E. Lee on the riverfront, on the Mississippi riverfront in downtown St. Louis, Missouri, because pre-war, Lee built a wing dam that's diverted the Mississippi and stopped it from creating a sandbar that would have made St. Louis a non-port city. So he kept it operable as a river port by the series of wing dams that he built to keep the water going this way and not that way, and creating a sandbar. So these are guys who know how to get things done, and they did. And it's not to take away from the infantrymen or the artillerists or the other guys who were experts in their field, but the engineers were more creative thinkers in many ways. And so when people say, oh, the best generals, but a lot of the best ones went into the engineer corps. And we saw out of 93 engineer officers, only 15 went to the South. And so I forget which Confederate general it was who said that the North got all the smart generals, but the South got the fighting generals. Well, okay, maybe that's true, but there's no disputing that most of the engineers, the brainiacs, went north.
Right. And, you know, of course, I think it's so easy to dismiss the engineers because, I mean, who doesn't like a plumed hat and a sword and all of that stuff, right? You know, it's much more romantic than the guy with the shovel and the surveying equipment. But there's no doubt that the war couldn't have been won if it wasn't for the engineers.
No, and that's true. And there's, we didn't get into it, but there's no disparagement to the quartermaster corps. But if you look at the most successful Civil War generals in the Union side, the Holy Trinity is Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, right? All 3 of them had been quartermasters at one point or another in their career. Braxton Bragg and Joe Johnston were both quartermasters. So these are guys that led armies. They understood what army requirements were, like having how to get that, not just to accumulate the material, but how to get it to where it needed to be when it was needed.
Absolutely.
I think that's another parallel that gets overlooked. And oh, well, they lost. They had this many men and they lost. Well, yeah, maybe.
No, absolutely. You know, thank you so much for shedding light on that myth, dispelling that myth. I appreciate you coming on the show. We're definitely going to put your link in the description below for people to learn more about you, and definitely invite you to these do talks at roundtables and historical societies, because this is a real wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.